So thanks very much. After those two very thought-provoking and quite deep reflections, I am left to talk about the grubby business of politics, which is always everyone's favourite subject, obviously, and particularly how the politics of rough sleeping and how political decisions have impacted on the situation we're in today. So a well-known fact in this room that the most visceral and conspicuous form of homelessness, rough sleeping, has dramatically increased in recent years. The government's own statistics say that rough sleeping has risen by 134% since 2010, and we could sit here for the next 10 minutes and talk only about numbers and data. And while data and numbers are an important part of that debate, they're not the sole part, and frankly the differences in how we record data and measure homeless people, is so stark that it's a complicated picture. And so I wanted to just briefly touch on the numbers and then park them and then talk about kind of where we are and how we got here. So on Thursday, the government will release its yearly updated figures on the number of rough sleepers in England on a given night in October last year. Last year, that number was 4,134, and the government will update it, as I say, on Thursday. But in London, the Mayor funds the Combined Homelessness and Information Network, or CHAIN in the jargon, which many of you know, which is a database which records the instances of working with rough sleepers in the capital. And they recorded 8,100 cases in a similar time period in 2016. Meanwhile, at Housing Justice, we estimate that 5,800 people used a church or faith-run community night shelter in 2016-17. Then there's our friends at Crisis, who say that somewhere in the region of 9,000 people are sleeping rough in round about the same time frame. And then there's Shelter, who say that the broader form of homelessness, that's not people sleeping rough, but people without a permanent home, is about 250,000. So there's a big difference in numbers. There's a big difference in how we measure things. So rather than talk endlessly about numbers, I begin from a starting point that homelessness in the United Kingdom over the last 10 years has grown exponentially, and that is unacceptable. So I want to talk briefly about how we got here, what the situation is now, and a few brief thoughts on what can be done. So I think a good place to start is to say that the politics of rough sleeping in our country, and perhaps more generally, has always been really a fine balance between the kind of primal instincts of self, of tribe, and of territory, versus concepts of community, solidarity, and compassion, and all that set within a context of scarce resources. And that doesn't matter what time frame you operate in. In fact, the kind of three questions that I would suggest we constantly ask ourselves throughout generations are, do you really need my help? Do you deserve my help? And are you part of my tribe? Now, these are distinctly un-Christian principles, based largely, I would argue, on judgments of a honourable and a dishonourable poor, of a deserving and an undeserving poor, where the former are to be helped and the latter largely hidden from public view and variously defined as idle or vagabonds or tramps, beggars, or more latterly, shirkers. So you can go all the way back to the Statute of Cambridge in 1388, and then travel all the way through the 1600s and the Poor Laws, right up to the 20th century, to see those principles applied to British policy making with regard homelessness, and I would argue much of that framework is in place in legislation today. But there are some particular characteristics of homelessness in 2018, in Britain in 2018, which are significantly different from that which has gone past. In particular, the paradox that we sit in a city tonight, in a country today, with record employment, more people employed in Britain today than at any time in our history, and yet such high levels of homelessness in all its forms. And I think there's three primary reasons for that. One is the extraordinary growth, or really the return, of the private rented sector. Really the return of the private rented sector as the tenure of the housing tenure for people in poverty, frankly, which hasn't been the case for 40 or 50 years in the UK, but is today. The ending of a tenancy in the private rented sector is the biggest single cause of statutory homelessness in England and Wales, and the proportion of households accepted as homeless by local authorities due to the end of a tenancy in the private sector is increased from 11% in 2009-10 to 32% in 2016-17. As many of you know, I'm a private renter. As many of you know, rising rents too contribute to homelessness. So since 2010, the cost of private rented accommodation, the cost of rents, has far outstripped that of wage growth across England and Wales. In London, rents went up by 24% in between 2010 and 2015-16. Wages, average earnings, went up by 3%. It's also no coincidence that homelessness tends to be higher in places where private rents grow quickest. So, reason one, private rented sector. Reason two, wage stagnation and insecure work. The defining characteristic of 21st century kind of developed economies is that wages are broadly flat since the financial crisis in 2007. In fact, to cheer you all up, the Resolution Foundation say that in 2022, wages will be £20 lower, average earnings will be £20 lower on average than the biggest squeeze on wage than since the Napoleonic Wars, which is the biggest squeeze on wages in modern history. Not since the Napoleonic Wars, since before the crisis, which is the biggest squeeze since the Napoleonic Wars. So, rents are going up, wages are stagnant, so therefore the only way to keep people in their homes would surely be to subsidise housing through the welfare system. Third reason that homelessness has increased so dramatically. As we all know, since 2010, the UK government, in various guises, has pursued policies which amount to the biggest peacetime changes in welfare policy ever. These reforms have contributed to homelessness. They're not my words, by the way, they're the words of the National Audit Office. And, you know, again, if I listed all of the changes to welfare, we will, again, not have much else to talk about, but measures such as the capping and freezing of local housing allowance, removing housing benefit from 18 to 21-year-olds, the rollout of universal credit, and particularly some of the issues associated with payment in arrears and sanctions. So all of those measures introduced to incentivise welfare recipients to work more, but having a real effect on household income. And at the same time as all of that, local government, as you all know, has seen huge cuts in their budgets, which have meant that which has meant that spending on preventative measures has basically collapsed, whilst spending on the emergency end, particularly temporary accommodation, has increased dramatically, up 34% since 2010. We spend about £1 billion on homelessness in this country, and about £850 million of that goes on temporary accommodation. So they aren't the only reasons why homelessness is increased, or why some people find themselves homeless. But I would argue they are the major policy drivers behind that. In our work at Housing Justice, we do a lot of work with the night shelters in our network, some of which we've spoken about tonight, and we ask lots of questions about why people are in the shelter. And some of those issues that have always been there are still there, and still a large proportion of people in a night shelter cite relationship breakdown as a key reason they're in the shelter. 33% of guests in night shelters in 2016-17 cited that. In London in particular, it's worth saying that the nationality breakdown of guests in night shelter is significantly different from what it is elsewhere in the country. According to our data, about 24% of guests using a night shelter were, in fact, half of all guests using a night shelter are non-UK nationals, and about 24% are non-EEA nationals. And I particularly want to mention that because I think it gets forgotten. We focus a lot on various forms of homelessness, various groups of homeless, but particularly in housing justice, and I'll pay tribute to Capital Mass on this, asylum seekers or people with difficult immigration status are a huge proportion of people using night shelters in London. And they, I would argue, are the 21st century's undeserving poor, often without access to benefits and reliant on hosting schemes such as that run by organisations like Capital Mass and Housing Justice. So that was a depressing bit. There is, I think, a glimmer of hope that there's the beginnings of a political consensus that all political parties now realise that we have a homelessness crisis. And you only need to look at the party manifestos from last year to realise that things are changing slightly. So the Conservative Party manifesto pledged to halve rough sleeping by the end of the Parliament, so over the 5 years, and eliminate it altogether by 2027. The Labour Party manifesto pledged to do the same thing within the Parliament, and the Lib Dems and the SNP made similar commitments. The Homelessness Reduction Act is a good example of cross-party working on homelessness, and will, I think, make a difference particularly at a local authority level. The Chancellor in his budget in the autumn announced some positive measures to reduce rough sleeping, including money for Housing First. So that's good stuff and it's all encouraging. But in 2018, I think it's really, really easy to say homelessness is bad, and it's a bit like standing up in a room and saying that cancer's bad. We all know it's bad. We all know that it shouldn't happen. It's much harder to look at the root causes and to ask yourself what role I play in some of those root causes. And just as an example of that, and particularly in a political setting, so whilst all of those pledges on ending rough sleeping are great, the Conservative manifesto also said they continue with their programme of welfare reform. And actually even the Labour Party manifesto agreed to reverse about £2 billion worth of the £9 billion worth of welfare cuts. The truth is, rough sleeping is fuelled by the numbers of hidden homeless people and those people in housing need. And that's fuelled by poverty and systemic issues in our housing market, our economy and our welfare system. And it's easy to blame the politicians. Sometimes actually it's quite justified to blame the politicians. But it isn't only governments who have a role to play in ending rough sleeping and reducing homelessness. It's society, it's all of us. And my favourite housing/homelessness crisis piece of research is that in The Guardian in 2016, they did a survey and they asked people, what do you think the single biggest driver of the housing crisis in the United Kingdom is? and 60% of respondents said that the biggest single factor was immigration. 53% said that the biggest single factor was foreign investors buying up properties as investments. So a majority of respondents to that survey thought that the biggest factors in the housing crisis were nothing to do with them. They were to do with somebody else, and by implication, we're all free from blame on that front. And I don't think that's right. There wasn't a vote for viewing housing as investments that appreciate in value rather than homes where people live. There wasn't a significant vote for asking questions about where someone's country of origin or local connection is. There wasn't anything about any of that stuff. So what did we do? No one has the right answer, but the Irish have a proverb that it's in the shelter of each other that the people live. In fact, on the continent of Africa, there's a similar proverb, Ubuntu, which I've heard, and many of you will have heard Desmond Tutu define as, my humanity is inextricably bound up in yours. And so I leave you with this thought. My son is just about 5 months old, so pray for a good night's sleep for me tonight. But I'm absolutely convinced that at some point in the next 25 years, he is going to ask me, how on earth did your generation let homelessness reach the levels it reached? And I will tell him. But I'll also, I believe, be able to say, and this is how we started to bring it down, and this is how we laid the foundation to end homelessness in our country, or at least rough sleeping. Because I genuinely think when you think of all of the world's problems, when you think of all of those insurmountable, perplexing issues that afflict our generation, homelessness, Trump, artificial intelligence, Brexit, Trump, against all of those, homelessness seems so beatable, doesn't it? Ending it seems so doable. And all it really takes is you and me to invite others into the shelter of our lives. So let's make that our prayer, and let's make that our evangelism. Thanks very much.